the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, largemouth bass hit on fairies at a big lake tournament in Arkansas, but they're not hitting in a romantic way. Forced perspectives and supernatural resolution, plus a special audio presentation redux, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. This time we have Tim Powers, the great fantasy author, wonderful storyteller, winner of many awards, and herder of many ghosts, talking to us about his new novel, Forced Perspectives. Really looking forward to that. This novel is set in L.A., which is Tim's actual stomping grounds, and Tim's L.A. novels are always full of really cool stuff that he's dug up about L.A., literally dug up in some instances. So stay tuned for that. Plus, we present a special rerun of an excellent audio story presentation from the hallowed and haunted coffers of the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. Now here's the news. Hey, get in on the March contest while you can. It's a fun one. Curtains for Humanity. In Frank Chadwick's latest novel, Ship of Destiny, Sam Bitka and his crew encounter a race of immortals bent on destroying humankind. Chadwick puts his own unique spin on the tale, but this isn't the first time aliens have attempted to take humans down a notch, in fiction at least. So, in a short paragraph, 100 words or so, tell us what your favorite science fiction novel, film, or television show in which extraterrestrials threaten our existence is, and why, for a chance to win a copy of Ship of Destiny signed by Frank Chadwick. Send your entry in the hollow body of an email to contest@baen.com and send those in by March 20th. And if you win, we'll send you a free signed copy of Ship of Destiny by Frank Chadwick. So get them in. I want to welcome Tim Powers back to the podcast. Hey, Tim, it's great to have you back.
Hello, great to be back here. Always fun.
Tim Powers won the World Fantasy Award twice for the critically acclaimed novels Last Call and Declare. Declare also received the International Horror Guild Award, and On Stranger Tides inspired that video game series and sold to Disney for the movie franchise installment of Pirates of the Caribbean On Stranger Tides. His classic, was it? Yeah, and you visited the set and things like that, right?
Yeah. Got to chat about Hunter Thompson with Johnny Depp.
Did Depp meet him, or did he meet you?
They were pals.
Well, they
in
did.
Fact,
he did that movie, right? Yeah.
And Depp paid for Thompson's ashes being fired out of a cannon at the memorial service.
Well, Hunter Thompson would have liked that.
Yeah.
Depp was right. So, I used to. I don't know. Did you ever meet Jack Womack, the science fiction writer?
Yeah, he went a couple times.
Yeah. I was roommates with Jack for a couple of years back in when I lived in New York, and he had a portrait of Hunter S. Thompson that Hunter S. Thompson had shot up on his wall.
That's very cool.
Jack was a collector, and man, he had that was one of his showpieces. So anyway, let's go on. The Anubis Gates, your first, well, it wasn't your first novel, not at all, but it was a novel that won the Philip K. Dick Award, and I consider it, and many consider it, a modern science fiction classic, kind of the progenitor of the steampunk genre also. Tim won the Dick Award again for Dinner at Deviant's Palace, another great book that I love. Many of his novels, such as Last Call and Alternate Routes, are sort of the secret histories, and we'll talk about that maybe a little,
which are, I guess alternate routes isn't really a secret history, and forced perspectives.
Yeah. They're not set in the past.
Right.
They have elements from the past which come in.
Anyway, but you do use real historical events in which supernatural and metaphysical elements influence the story in weird and compelling manners. Oh, yes, you do. Tim grew up in Southern California. He went to Cal State Fullerton with a bunch of other science fiction writers. And you're also a practicing Catholic. I hope you're getting good at it, because we're going to need
Practicing long enough now, yeah.
Who claims stories are more effective and more truly represent the writer's actual conventions when they manifest themselves without the writer's conscious assistance. I concern myself with my plots, but I let my subconscious worry about my themes, says Tim Powers. And you reside in Southern California with your wife, Serena, the wonderful Serena. So out now at booksellers everywhere is Forced Perspectives, in hardcover and in ebook form. This is related to alternate routes, or as Yankees might say, alternate routes.
Yeah, the two characters from alternate routes at the end had dealt with their difficulties, but were left with a certain disjointed relationship with time because of what happened to them in alternate routes. They don't exist exclusively in the moment of now. They slightly overlap the past, and so they're able to sort of concentrate and look past what they are immediately seeing, sort of the way you would look at those pictures that were popular a few years ago, a bunch of just sort of confetti dots, but if you focus right, you'd see a motorcycle or a shark in them. I forget what those were called. Mm-hmm. I was never able to see anything in them.
Tessellation exactly is something else, but yeah.
Yeah, and so our characters are now able to sort of look through the moment of now and see their surroundings as they were, say, an hour or two ago. And alternate routes ends with them simply noting that they now have this ability. And Forced Perspectives brings a problem to them. They're now separate. Vickery is living in Southern California, and Castine is back at her job on the East Coast. But both of them become aware that instead of being able to see the recent past now, instead they exclusively see a certain decrepit, ruined old house. And each successive time they see it, their viewpoint is closer to it, and they begin to see a person in the house. And all they can conclude is that this is some scene from the past, and various parallel developments indicate that this is bad news, that this is leading towards some culmination of bad things that went on in L.A. and Hollywood in the 1960s during the bad times that sort of culminated with Charles Manson and various Satanist activities.
Well, what is all right? So in alternate routes, we are introduced to this L.A. Of yours, where you live, and in real life. And it's kind of it's full of these ghosts, and they're created in alternate routes by the sort of resonance of cars passing stationary. I don't know. Explain how the ghosts work.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, it occurred to me that a free will, any individual free will, which is to say a human being, is a violation of natural deterministic law. I mean, atoms have to go where Newton or Niels Bohr say they have to go, but if the atoms are part of a human being's hand, they will instead go to reach for either a beer or a Coke, depending on the free will of the person. And so given that, in effect, every little pocket of free will, which is to say every person, is a moving violation of natural law, it occurred to me that if you have a bunch of them moving past a stationary one, you have something parallel to electrons moving past stationary electrons, like Faraday spinning a magnet inside a coil of copper wire, which generates an electromagnetic field, which, extends. It diminishes as the square of the distance, but it extends powerfully for some distance around it. And I thought, okay, well, if these free wills moving are likewise generating a field, what kind of field would you like it to be? And I thought, well, if it's a violation of nature, it must be supernatural. And therefore, of course, things which are impossible according to strict cause and effect logic would be possible in this field, and therefore ghosts manifest. I mean, it stands to reason, right? And so,
absolutely.
If you're in of course.
Ergo.
Ergo, exactly. So around freeways, there is this field generated, and most people aren't aware of it, but there's a kind of subculture of freeway gypsies who set up little nests in the freeway shoulder greenery and can consult ghosts. And this, of course, leads to all kinds of complications and problems.
All right, so ghosts are not the souls of people in this sense, right? There's something different and a little less.
Yeah, I posit, actually I got the idea from G.K. Chesterton, that in the stress of dying, when the body collapses inert and the soul goes away to the Elysian fields or Valhalla or heaven or hell or wherever, fragments are flung off from this stressful event, and they consist of kind of animate cast-off snake skins, a kind of semi-sentient replica of the original person working on a 40 IQ, which thinks it's the original person and has most of the memories of the original person, but is in fact an ephemeral, temporary, peripheral effect. But while it's present, you can talk to it after a fashion, though it's not very bright. You can't hold its attention, no attention span to speak of. And, of course, it's kind of traumatic if it's the ghost of someone you loved, because it's this kind of mockery almost, this kind of pointless reminder of the original person, and you kind of feel bad if you're interrogating it. So it's a emotionally dubious sort of situation.
Yeah. So you have that, and who we met in alternate routes, and our main characters in Forced Perspective, who are Sebastian Vickery and Ingrid Castine, and Santiago carries over as well, right? How do they have to do with ghosts, and where are they at the beginning of Forced Perspective?
Well, at the beginning of Forced Perspectives, Castine, after about a year of not seeing Vickery, uses a signal they agreed on in the previous book to meet. And Vickery is very cautious about going to the meeting place at the prescribed time, because he has noticed evidence of somebody monitoring him and following him. And so he is not certain that Castine has been as careful as he has been to avoid surveillance. But they get together and immediately find that, in fact, Castine has inadvertently led the mysterious powers to them, and they find they have to take off running and figure out what it is that this mysterious power wants with them. And they do wind up meeting again Santiago, the fugitive Mexican boy who by this time is about 12. And he functions as kind of an artful dodger character. Makes a living by sort of watching and carrying messages among the semi-occult subcultures of Los Angeles. And he finds himself, too, involved in this big project, which is being furthered by a turns out, renegade, semi-crazy computer genius fugitive from Silicon Valley.
Who's dabbling in things that he ought not to dabble in.
He is, in fact, doing that. Yeah, he has got hold of a variant Egyptian hieroglyph, which people have been trying to suppress for centuries. And he's using it to ideally create a kind of what's known as an egregore. Big news in occult circles to this day, which is
that's a real word.
It's a real word. Yeah,
out there.
Everybody, Aleister Crowley and all that crowd were messing with it. And the idea is that if you get a group of people together and in resonance, a thing can manifest, an intelligence, an entity, which is sort of buds off from them, becomes an independent entity, thing, intelligence, and it then can use that original crowd of people who generated it as its fingers and manipulative tools. And our Silicon Valley fugitive considers this a good thing and is working to incorporate ideally the whole world, but certainly as many people as he can. And he finds that he needs this overmind thing, needs the equivalent of the thalamus humans have in their brains, which is kind of equivalent to, in some ways, a computer's router. I could go on at length. And it needs to be two people with a very special relationship with linear time. In effect, kind of a freedom from the restrictions of linear time. And our two poor protagonists turn out to qualify, and he wants to incorporate them forcibly into his projected overmind. But it's costly and not what they would like to participate in, and so there's conflict there.
Yeah, well, they don't. They're the reason that they can do this is because they basically crossed over into this sort of the shadow labyrinth world in alternate routes. So it's not really the afterlife, but it's kind of the ghost afterlife, and then they managed to get back.
Yeah, so they crossing over and coming back, crossing over into a virtual afterlife, and then coming back to the real world has left them not firmly moored in their little sockets of sequential time. They rattle a little in the sockets now. They're not a comfortable fit anymore, which does give them their ability to see the recent past of wherever they are, and qualifies them for this egregore entity.
Yeah.
It's also the reason they're having this vision of the old Victorian mansion in the valley.
Right. It turns out that old Victorian mansion, which was in fact torn down in 1969, they're seeing it as it was in 1968, when some very heavy occult stuff happened there, and they're finding themselves involved in somebody trying to do it again, and so they find themselves having to find out what exactly did happen in 1968 there.
Well, let's touch on that without giving too much away. But can you tell? But we haven't really talked about the characters of Sebastian or Vickery and Castine, and they're really capable. Vickery's ex-cop. I think she is too, right? So these are not people to mess with if you happen to be a billionaire trying to kill them.
Yeah, Vickery had been L.A. cop and then joined subsequently the Secret Service, but then had to flee after he inadvertently eavesdropped on a very secret occult project of the government, and has been living kind of under the radar for the last 6 or 8 years. And Castine had been an agent with that sort of splinter Secret Service group, and she, by preventing Vickery from being captured and quietly executed, found herself on the bad list of that secret government agency, and found herself having to work under the radar. And so, yeah, both of them have in their past a pretty extensive training, which they, of course, now find useful in these kind of outside the border of normal life adventures.
And they're not together romantically. But they're friends.
And they're always kind of careful friends.
Kind of Mulder,
they're always
Scully kind of.
Yeah. In fact, when I originally decided that they should not be romantically involved, though there's always kind of the nebulous possibility of it in the future, I kind of was thinking of Modesty Blaise and Willie Garvin from those books by Peter O'Donnell, where there's always a kind of, you're always very aware that Modesty and Willie are very closely involved in appalling adventures, but they never do step over the line into an actual romantic relationship. So there's always kind of like the story is the spark between the two electrodes. The intrigue is in the gap.
So we have some appealing heroes here, and what is maybe we should go back to Cecille B. DeMille, or even beyond that to ancient Egypt, and talk a little bit about this Ba, enough so that we can get an idea of what the story is.
Well, in Egyptian mythology, there are two sort of core gods. You could almost call them two poles. And they're so basic that they aren't really so much gods in the sense of personalities with goals and allies. They're kind of bases of simple existence. Ba is the potential for souls to exist, like a carrier wave is a potential for a radio signal to be transmitted. It's not a personality in itself. It's simply the ground from which personalities can occur. And Nu, the contrary of Ba, is kind of the eternal identity sink in which identities and awarenesses can be negated. It's kind of the ultimate negation of everything. And so they're kind of complementary opposites. And they have their respective hieroglyphs. And for the story, I posit that the hieroglyphs of Ba and Nu that you'll find in textbooks of Egyptian mythology are slightly inaccurate. You can open a textbook and gaze steadily at, say, the Ba hieroglyph and not have any effects. But if you could get hold of the original one, of which those textbook ones are distortions, you would have some psychic consequences of looking steadily at it. You would, in fact, invoke it. And so somebody, a sort of amateur Egyptologist, occultist, secretly put a copy of the original Ba hieroglyph on one of the walls of Cecille B. DeMille's Pharaoh's Palace set when DeMille was filming the Ten Commandments. And DeMille became aware of this and didn't want this potent, dangerous hieroglyph to appear in his movie, or in fact to remain on the set and possibly have bad consequences for people later. And so when he was finished filming the movie, and this is all true, at least what I'm about to say, he dug a giant trench and got bulldozers and pushed the entire set into this trench and buried it. And in fact, today, archaeologists at the Guadalupe Dunes, north of Santa Barbara, where DeMille filmed, they're digging up that set and resurrecting sphinxes and things from the DeMille movie. But in my story...
that seems dangerous after I've read... having read Forced Perspectives.
Yeah, they better be careful. But in my book, the hieroglyph is, in fact, retrieved and comes into the possession of a satanic biker club in the late 60s, which there were a whole lot of satanic biker clubs in the L.A. area then.
Tim, how the hell do you find out about this understreet history of LA? Is it just a passion of yours?
I suppose, sure. I mean, it's an interesting thing. One beautiful source is Ed Sanders' book called The Family, in which he talks not so much about the Manson family themselves as the environment of Los Angeles and Hollywood in the late 60s that kind of sprouted the Manson phenomenon. And there's, weird sects and cults and biker gangs and indie movies, and it's just a festering swamp of what, among other things, is beautiful material to base a book on.
Yeah. So there's the Gardena Satanic Motorcycle Club, and they got in hold of this sigil.
Right. And they use it to maintain the entirety of their club membership, even including members who have died. It's sort of one for all and all for one, including dead members, which is possible if you have the Ba hieroglyph to sort of sustain the ghosts of the bikers who have been killed. And they resent it when a sort of crazy hippie fugitive from the Laurel Canyon culture, which was Frank Zappa and Mama Cass Elliot and all them. He steals the sigil from the biker gang and wants to use it for his own purposes, and so there's bad feelings there back in 1968, which in fact have resonances today.
So what this thing can do is allow, if you do the ritual right, you can make an egregore.
Yeah. You'll find yourself, if you stare fixedly at the hieroglyph, you'll find that you're mentally established a link with all the other people who have stared fixedly at it as well. It's kind of a doorway into an increasingly crowded chamber. And, of course, in order to trick people into staring fixedly at it for several minutes, the bad guys have printed it as a page of a coloring book. And on the theory that in order to color in all the little spaces, it'll be required that you do, in fact, stare fixedly at the thing for several minutes and inadvertently trigger the effect, which is actually very clever, I think. That was clever of the characters to think of making it a coloring book page.
So who are what will they gain from doing this? And is there a power to this thing? And who are they other than Harlow?
Yeah, what the bad guys see as attractive in becoming a part of this thing is virtual immortality. You become a part of this big entity which is independent of the physical bodies of its members, and so you're freed from the necessity of being in one place at one time, having to spend a third of your life asleep, having to eat. The little peripheral bodies will take care of that sustenance type work, and as the egregore gets bigger and incorporates more people, those little physical bodies that are sustaining the thing can be allowed to die, starve, deteriorate, because you're always incorporating more. It's sort of the way a human body discards blood cells regularly, because there's always more being made. And so the attractiveness is you get to ditch your personal physical concerns and also your personal physical guilt, ignorances, limitations. You get to share the enormous collective IQ of the egregore and its innocence. Your individual guilts and fears and personal shortcomings are left behind. You get to sort of be part of a clean slate. And if you've led a very discreditable, disgraceful life, this is an attractive prospect.
So in a way, it's, if you are, for instance, afraid of dying and going to hell, it's a way to at least put that off forever, or to get out of it, to get out of hell free.
They kind of suspect that there may be something to the idea of karma, sin, retribution, judgment. Vaguely, they suspect there may actually be something like that after you die, and that's a troublesome thought if you, in fact, have a whole lot of bad actions in your past. And so, yeah, joining this thing would be a way to evade that distasteful eventuality.
Yeah. Well, tell us about some of the this sort of constellation of on the bad guy side, as it were, the Rogotsky, Agnes Loria, and these crazy twins who are very fascinating characters to me.
Yeah, well, Rogotsky is a young man who joined the thing on kind of a philosophical basis, but when he meets Agnes Loria and recruits her into it, he, to his dismay, falls in love with her, and therefore reconsiders the attractiveness of losing his individual self, and even worse, seeing her lose her individual self. And so he's now kind of a reluctant player in the whole egregore scheme. Agnes, on the other hand, thinks it's great. She looks forward to losing herself and incidentally losing her affection for poor Rogotsky. So Rogotsky finds himself allying with Vickery and Castine in an attempt to stop the whole egregore thing and therefore stop Agnes from being able to lose herself, which Rogotsky finds very attractive. He likes herself. He doesn't want it dissolved into a bigger thing. And let's see, who else was there? There's
there's Amanda and Lexi.
Oh yeah, the twins, right? Yeah, the twins are our bad guy's nieces, and our bad guy manages to incorporate them, and they already were suffered from sort of dissociative symptoms, but when they are exposed to the fracturing hieroglyph, they get to the point where they are not any longer distinct individuals. They fall in and out of each other's minds. They don't think of themselves as I and you, or when they do, it varies. They're not sure which of themselves they are. And this makes them very handy as a backup thalamus for our main bad guy, Simon Harlow. If it doesn't work out with Vickery and Castine, he can always use the twins as a thalamus, though they're definitely second best because they're completely erratic and unpredictable and kind of contrary, kind of perverse, kind of resistant to instruction. And so it was nice to get these two blameless little girls involved in this bad scheme, and not to give it away, but they turn out okay.
And there is our Egyptian secret agent, Latif Fakouri.
Yeah. Well, he was a minor clerk with the Egyptian intelligence agency, which was entirely remade after a revolution in 2011, as I recall. But he finds some records of the previous disbanded intelligence service, which have to do with that 1968 attempt to use the Ba hieroglyph, which the agent in 1968 thought had been closed, finished, ended. But Fakouri finds evidence that, in fact, new coloring books are being printed, and it looks like the thing is being attempted again. And he finds himself kind of duty-bound to get himself assigned to the King Tut exhibit in Los Angeles as cover so that he can covertly do his best to prevent the Ba hieroglyph from being sacrilegiously used to make this very non-Egyptian egregore. And so even though he's not really qualified...
Go ahead.
well, even though he's not really qualified to do, undercover Secret Service type work, he finds himself having to, in effect, be a one-man representative of Egypt and prevent the sacrilegious misuse of this sacred Egyptian symbol.
Yeah, and he is he's a very fun, mysterious figure that we slowly learn what he's about.
He kind of stumbles and misunderstands and getting himself way too deeply involved more than he's comfortable with. He's always dismayed at having to get involved in these things and doesn't really totally appreciate the help he's getting from Vickery and Castine. Both parties wish the other party was not involved. And so he kind of goes stumbling through kind of a, I don't want to say Oliver Hardy figure, but kind of clumsily doing his best.
Yeah, well, he seems like a fun noir kind of character. I mean, the mysterious Egyptian keeps showing up, and
yeah, and of course the LA occult subculture notes his fleeting appearances because, of course, there had been an Egyptian involved 50 years earlier in 1968, and they think, oh no, Egyptian interference again, because in 68 it had been that agent of the previous Egyptian Secret Service.
Yeah, he's following. That guy's is a spiritual mentor, at least. I don't think he ever met him, but right.
Yes. He wants to rescue the twins, Lexi and Amber, because he sees them as parallel to a couple of girls he saw many years earlier in, I don't remember the name of the Egyptian suburb, the Cairo suburb, but it's the garbage city. It's the city where all of Egypt's, Cairo's garbage is collected and sorted and you might say recycled. And he failed to rescue two girls he saw years ago and kind of feels that if he can rescue Lexi and Amber, it will to some degree redeem that failure years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the bad thing about the reason that Vickery and Castine are trying to prevent this, and he sort of provides some of the background on this, is that the Ba egregore is going to result in death. It's not a good thing to have happen. Much like many socialist schemes. Never mind, I didn't say that. Sorry. This group mind is not a good thing.
Yeah.
And the people who like it because they get to subsume individuals who ultimately don't matter into the big controlling group, which is all that does matter.
Yeah. And I really like that you brought in that dancing plague, the mania because it's come up recently with talking about the latest coronavirus stuff that we're in the midst of as we record this.
Yeah, that's right. We are in the midst of it.
Yeah, as a mania that afflicted like villages.
Yeah, which of course is still mysterious. Nobody to this day knows why the dancing madness happened in the Middle Ages, and of course a natural parallel that occurs to one is the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. So I figured, again, ergo, it must be that the dancing madnesses incidents in Europe were evidences of failed egregores. When you get all the group minds together and the thing doesn't spark, like cranking a car's engine, but the engine won't turn over, the consequence is that the people you've incorporated, to an extent, simply go crazy. There's no overmind that was created to govern them, and so they're left with a vacuum where there should have been a mind, and they just go dancing away into the landscape.
And dance till they die.
Yeah. God knows what was going on actually in the Middle Ages with that.
So what else could we say about forced perspectives that we might want to bring up? I guess one of the things, the ghost can get you with a big old tongue that you've posited that kind of freezes you.
Yeah, it's ectoplasmic, basically. They can sort of force a contact with you, force an overlap, and they do it by extruding their tongues like chameleons or something. Well, they force an overlap briefly, and in that overlap, if you're not careful, they can jump across and at least briefly exchange personalities with you, so that they are, at least for a moment, inhabiting your physical body, while you, for a moment, are the ephemeral ghost trying to figure out how to fix this with the ghost's 40 IQ. Very dangerous, and luckily there are ways to break the connection. But yeah, the La Brea tar pits strikes me as a very obvious, again, ergo, way to avoid, to be able to die without having a ghost of yourself wandering around and possibly being used by people for bad purposes. Somebody mentions that mummies were part of the dressing mummies got was creosote, which is a derivative of tar. And tar kind of can insulate your substance so that any ghosts that get thrown off in your death stay under the tar. And so, of course, at one point it becomes imperative that they interview a dead person whose ghost is preserved in the tar. And it's a very colorful, dangerous, disquieting, spectacular, upsetting ordeal to summon somebody out of the tar pits. And, of course, you're going to wind up summoning other things that died in the tar pits inadvertently as you're trying to sort through and find the guy you're after. It was fun using the tar pits because you do really get, as the characters get, an impression that amidst 21st century bustling Los Angeles, here is a pocket of timelessness, Paleolithic and Jurassic and every other Carboniferous era is, in a sense, present here. It's like LA is surface, but this is very deep time.
Yeah. You have used so much of the weirdness of LA in your work that I guess you probably can't run out, though, right?
The nice thing about LA is, people see it, they arrive at LAX, they go to their hotel, they walk up and down Hollywood Boulevard, and they go home and they think, it's all just tinsel, it's all just facade, veneer. But if you stop and kind of walk down an alley or drive up into the hills, it's just teeming with odd bits of peculiar history, which are still vibrating in place. There's strange Eastern temples in valleys up in the hills that you'd swear you can only get to by covert stairways. I mean, I've looked at some of these valleys, and there's monks in robes in these odd domed temples And you think, there's no road into here. I think they can only get in and out by this stairway. And odd history. You look at an ordinary old house at the top of a hill, but if you read up on it, you think that is the very house where, and then you can finish that sentence almost any way you want. And it's all under semi-tropical sunlight, palm trees, unlike the kind of Gothic atmosphere you think of in European stories of haunted London or Prague or Paris. This is bright sunlight, loud contemporary music, but with the weird old Hispanic, cinematic, weird Eastern cults, all that stuff kind of bubbling right under the surface.
Well, it's great stuff when you write about it. What are you working on now?
Actually, I'm writing a third Vickery and Castine novel. Let's see. At the end of Forced Perspectives, Vickery has adopted the persona, just as a cover, of a UFO fanatic to explain his frequent trips into the Mojave Desert. He kind of drops hints that he's interested in the Roswell flying saucer and stuff like that, which, in fact, of course, he's not. But in this newest book, it turns out that he inadvertently stumbled across some people in the UFO fan crowd who had histories at Area 51 and fled, and he has totally unwittingly become party to some information that the government does not want anyone to have. And Castine, of course, working for naval intelligence when we last see her in Forced Perspectives, finds herself assigned to find this Vickery character and identify him for the intelligence community. And she's assigned a partner to make sure she doesn't renege and disregard her assignment.
Well, you have him out in Barstow. Is it a California story still?
It's California, yeah. In fact, the flying saucer subculture, has its own landmarks, important places, one of which happens to involve the relatively new, the last 20 or 30 years, Catholic cathedral in downtown Los Angeles. Turns out they built it on the very wrong place.
Well, I can't wait for that. But currently out at booksellers everywhere, is Forced Perspectives by Tim Powers. Tim, thank you so much for talking with us about the book. It's got a beautiful cover, doesn't it? I think it's the Adam Byrne cover.
Yeah, that's a gorgeous cover. I love it. Very mysterious, ominous.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, no trouble. Happy to do it.
And we also have the complete audio presentation of an excellent epic military fantasy short story by legendary writer and bladesmith Hank Reinhardt. It's called The Age of the Warrior.
The Age of the Warrior by Hank Reinhardt, read by Jeff Aguiar. The chatter and gaiety of the feast had been stilled, and although the candles still burned brightly, fear and apprehension darkened the great hall of Castle Glown. Rank was forgotten as lord and lady, townsmen and guardsmen mingled in small, quiet clusters. The low murmur of their voices would still as the door to the ducal chambers opened, but picked up as soon as only a serving man or maid appeared. The evening had started out well enough. Lyulf II, King of Livain, accompanied by his retinue and the Duke of Jagai, had arrived earlier in the day. The Duke of Glown had been well prepared for his royal guests, and the feast he had served was splendid. The recent treaty between King Lyulf II and Jagai, King of the Shang, was an event to be well remembered, and the Duke had spared no expenses to celebrate it. It was right after an impromptu wrestling match won by Asgalt, Duke of Jagai, against a young guardsman that the blow fell. A messenger arrived bearing the ill news that the Shang had invested Castle Kells, and it looked as if the castle would fall within a few days. Pandemonium broke loose, and the king with his closest advisers retired to the private chambers of the Duke of Glown. In the chambers the king sat hunched over a table, poring over a map as if seeking to change the very lay of the land with his thoughts. Around the table stood several of his ministers, while in the corner the two dukes engaged in a heated argument. The king glanced with annoyance at the two men, and with a tone of less than regal forbearance snarled, "Will you two stop that damned bickering and get over here? The whole kingdom is threatened, and you two argue over propriety?" Asgalt, about to make a point, stopped in mid-sentence and looked at the king. "Sire, I do not argue. I merely defend myself." The Duke of Glown, Colwyn by name, bowed from the waist and answered, "Your pardon, sire, but I feel that it is unseemly for a Duke of the Realm to wrestle a common guardsman, even if the man is a champion." Asgalt grunted in disgust. "Bah! You only object because I win." Lyulf glared at the two, then in his most kingly voice, "We do not care about wrestling, or the proprieties. We do care about advice." Colwyn, Duke of Glown, walked over with dignity and stationed himself behind the king. He was a tall man, with hair as white as snow, and a face lined with years of care and worry. However, the Duke of Jagai merely ambled over to the front of the king, and stood looking down at him. He saw a man full-grown, calm and stern, well-suited to rule, but in his mind's eye he also saw a young boy, gawping up at him in awe and wonder. Asgalt pointed to the map. "Look, you can see what has to be done, or at least tried." The king shook his head. "I said no." Asgalt slapped his thighs with anger. He was a large man with cold blue eyes shaded by iron-gray hair, thick-necked, running into massive shoulders and chest with arms to match. Only the iron-gray of his hair and the thickening midsection betrayed his age. He turned away, then turned back again. "You young puppy! Were you not a man grown, I'd shake some sense into you, king or no. By Kimwalt's eyes, all you have to do is look." The ministers glanced at each other in embarrassed silence, but the Duke of Glown spoke up in shocked reprimand. "Your Grace, you can't speak to the king like that. It isn't proper." Asgalt swelled and roared. "Proper? Proper? With Shang soon to be riding through every hamlet, butchering and pillaging till their black hearts' content, and you say, proper?" He shook his head in wonder, then continued in the same roaring voice. "Colwyn, you were one of the best fighting men I have ever seen, but—" His voice trailed, and he spoke to the king in a lower voice. "Do you remember when Colwyn and I held the breach during the siege of this castle? 15 years ago it was, and he wanted me to stand to the left rear as he was borne to the ducal chair." The king, despite his woes, grinned. He had heard this story at least once a month for the past 15 years. But then reality returned, and his face tightened. "Enough of this. Jagai has broken the treaty. The Shang are marching, and the kingdom has to be warned and the levy raised. I don't have time to sit and listen to your constant bickering." Asgalt nodded, dropped his pretended fury, and spoke seriously. "No, you don't. Nor do you have time to send a messenger the long way around the Blue Mountains. The Shang are already at Kells, and before you could move the long way around, they will be here, and the main army will be moving. Before the levy is raised, Lyvain will be open." He continued, "The only way to better the time is over the pass of Jagai. Once through, and the Shang can be avoided by a good man, the levy can be raised by the time the Shang reach here. We could easily catch them here, and there's only one man who knows the pass. Me." Lyolf sat and never spoke. All there knew his concern. Asgalt had been a close friend and adviser to his father. Indeed, he was responsible for his father gaining back the throne after the rebellion. But Asgalt had aged, and the journey he spoke of so easily was hard on even a much younger man, and the Shang were out in force. In the end, it was Colwyn who forced the issue. "Sire, the Duke is right. 'Tis the only chance that we have. The course of action is plain. You leave at once, taking the long road, and Asgalt leaves, for the pass." Lyolf nodded in final agreement. He looked at Asgalt, and his face softened. "Have a care, old warrior. Remember that a young king still needs old friends." The Duke grinned back at him, and for a moment his hard, craggy face looked boyish. "Old? Ask that young guardsman. He thought I was old, but his back and shoulder will tell him different this night." "Then take him with you. He looked tough as boot leather." Asgalt ruefully answered, "He is." The morning sun had not yet risen as the king and Duke Glaun watched Asgalt and Flann ride from the castle. The king shook his head in fear and spoke to his companion. "'Tis a fear, good Duke, that we may not see Asgalt again. Strange, that yet again the fate of this land rests on the shoulders of an outlander." Colwyn nodded his agreement. "There are no stronger ones for it to rest on." He paused, then continued. "He seemed more than merely eager to go. Is it that he fears his age, or is it his hatred for the Shang?" The morning fog had lifted, and now the sun shone warm. They rode at a steady pace, rarely speaking, each in his own thoughts. At noon they dismounted for a quick meal and to walk the horses. Flann, the guardsman, was a tall youth, wide and rangy in appearance, with jet-black hair and matching eyes. He looked at the Duke, then spoke. "Tell me, your grace, how is it that a chief of the Haggai becomes a Duke of Lyvain?" "That, lad, would take some telling. I'm not a Haggai, but a Brakit. I joined one of their raiding parties to settle a personal score against the Shang. Well, one thing led to another, and I ended up as chief. It was a good life. All the Haggai want to do is drink and fight. I'd probably be there still, but a Shang raiding party hit us one night. They killed everyone but me. They planned on strangling me, then stuffing the carcass." He chuckled. "That was a mistake. I broke loose. Killed a few more. I wandered a few years, then ended up in Lyvain, serving in the army. It was at Iron Mountain that I met old Lyulf. The line broke, and it was clear that the rebels were winning, so when the whole army broke and ran, I tried to stay alive. A couple of days later, I came on a man trying to fight 4 of the rebels and protect a boy. I killed the rebels, and the man followed me." He laughed outright. "It was a damn month before I found out it was the king. Old Lyolf was a cagey devil." His mind drifted back over the years, and he spoke in a low reverie, forgetting he had an audience, talking more to himself than to Flann. 5 years we wandered and fought, hiding out in hills and caves and with a few loyal to the crown. Finally we had an army, and we caught Morgon at Whitewater Flats. What a battle that was! I killed Morgon. Damn cut him near in half. But enough of me. How is it that a man of Livale ends up in Livain?
Flan smiled. Not much to tell, your grace. The wanderlust that hits many a young son of a poor farmer. I roamed a while, tried the sea, but my stomach didn't care for it. I fought with Lord Conlanac, was with him at Colnar Ridge. Got away, wandered a bit more, then ended up in Glown. The Duke hired me. He then added with a smile. He was impressed with my wrestling. Asgalt laughed, a full-throated bellow.
I knew that old devil was trying to set me up, and he damn near did. You almost had me, but I tricked you. You wrestle well. All you lack is age and experience.
Next time, your grace, I'll try not to be tricked. They continued on, and soon the land began to change. The rolling hills gave way to open woodland, and this in turn to lowlands with rich and fertile valleys. This was beautiful land, but now the beauty was marred by signs of war. Burnt farms, scattered livestock, and whole villages put to the sword. The occasional stink of death they encountered as they passed a burnt-out steading soon gave way to a horrible stench that filled the air and seemed to get into their very pores. Death was all about them. Asgalt reined in his mount.
Now 'tis time to arm. Shang are all about, and we'd best keep a sharp eye.
Quickly they stripped the pack-pony, and each donned his mail shirt, steel helmet, and slipped their shields onto their backs. Their spears they set horizontally, so that they wouldn't project upward and give warning of their presence. The Duke cut the pack-pony loose and sent it running with a slap on the rump.
From here, it's 2 days' ride, then a climb up the mountain, across the bridge, and it's over with. All we need to do now is avoid the Shang.
The stench grew worse as they neared the outskirts of a small village. They passed death in its most grotesque forms, bodies lying with complete abandonment, bloated bellies thrusting at the sun. Neither spoke. Flan with grim indifference passed the scene, but Asgalt's face grew flint-hard, and no expression crossed it. As they neared the crest of a small hill, they could hear the sounds of battle on the other side, screams and curses and yells of agony. Quickly they reined in and slipped from their horses, crawling stealthily to the top of the hill. The last act was played as they watched. One man still stood, jabbing feebly at the circling Shang warriors. At his feet lay a young girl, wide-eyed with terror. A warrior casually parried the spear, then slashed downward, and the man fell, blood spurting high in the air from a severed neck artery. The Shang circled the girl, making false attempts to grab her and laughing at her frantic movements. Flan started to rise, but Asgalt pulled him down. He turned angrily. "Why? There are only 5, and we can hit them before they know what's happening." Asgalt pointed to his left. In the distance, a large party of mounted men could be seen.
I feel as you do, but I've a kingdom to worry about. If we're caught, it could happen to the whole land.
The girl's screams caused them to look up. The Shang were now close about her, poking with their spears. Suddenly, Asgalt stood up, and now his fury was real. He reached down and dragged the startled Flan to his feet with one hand.
"Kimwald's balls! The day I can't kill 5 and outright 100, the kingdom can fall! Ride, damn you, ride! Grab the girl and ride!"
The Shang were still laughing and jabbing at the girl when the two hit them. The first died, never knowing what the strange pointed thing was that suddenly grew from his chest. The second turned, saw a flash, then nothingness engulfed him. The third screamed, parried a slashing sword, then had his neck broken by the edge of a shield. The fourth saw only a gray-haired demon suddenly appear and kill 3 of his companions, when a sword lashed out and cut deep into his side. He looked up in bewilderment, saw a pair of jet-black eyes, then life left him. The 5th almost made it, turning and galloping for the body of men in the distance. He fled for his life, but Asgalt wanted it also, and his sword took the man cleanly at the juncture of neck and shoulder. Asgalt reined in the Shang horse and led it back to Flan and the girl.
"Mount up and ride. They've seen us."
He nodded over his shoulder.
"Into the hills. We can cut over and hit the main trail by tomorrow."
The night was cold, and Asgalt cursed the Shang, the damp, and the very small fire. He was tired. The ride had been long and hard, but so far they had outdistanced the Shang. He looked at the two across the fire from him, the girl and Flan huddled close under a cloak, and Flan obviously enjoying it. The girl, Aithne, a baker's daughter, had been visiting an uncle when the Shang attacked. She had fled with several others, only to be caught out in the open. The girl shivered under the blanket and asked, "Do you think we've gotten away?" Flan shrugged. "Ask the Duke. I've never even seen Shang until today." "The Duke?" And her eyes grew wide. "Your Grace." And she made a motion as if to rise.
"Stay seated, girl. It's too cold and late for such nonsense."
Asgalt warmed his hands on the small blaze.
"No, one thing you can say for the Shang, they never quit. I'm surprised that one tried to run away. Never saw one break and run before. They're out there. My fear is that they know where we're headed."
Flan snuggled the girl closer and asked, "Why? And what is this pass of Jagai that we're headed to?"
"It's a pass up the mountain. No one knew of it until old Lyolf and I stumbled on it. The Shang can't use it as their cavalry, and no way you can get horses up it. We got to the top, then found there was a damn deep gorge. All the way to the bottom of the mountain it falls. I managed to get across it. That is how we got back into Lyvain after the rebellion. Later we built a bridge. Once across, we're in Jagai. I keep a way station about 3 miles down the mountain, so it'll be an easy walk and an easy ride to Jagai Castle. If they realize that's where we're headed, they'll have the whole army trying to stop us. Once we get across, the army can be raised and the whole attack is ruined."
Asgalt looked longingly at the fire, wishing it were larger, then doused it.
"Now get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a bad day."
Dawn broke, cold and clear, and when Asgalt awoke, Flan and the girl had already made another small fire. He was stiff, and his back hurt.
"Damn ill-trained horse,"
he muttered as he tried to stretch himself into some semblance of a man, rather than an aching mass of bones. He was peeved that they had awakened before he did. Usually he awoke first and fully alert, but now he felt that he needed more hours of sleep. He was groggy and only half awake as he munched his meager breakfast. They mounted, and began a slow, tiring ride up the hill. The terrain was rocky, with little clefts and culverts down a short, steep incline, then up a longer, steeper one. But slowly they climbed higher and higher. They rounded a bad bend, and the mountain loomed forbiddingly over them. They paused to rest the horses, and Asgalt was quite pleased when Flan suggested it. While the horses drank from a small mountain stream, the Duke looked back down the trail.
"Flan, come take a look. I can't make out anything, but do you see something? Seems to be some movement."
Flan shaded his eyes. "Shang, a large party. Anywhere from 50 to 100.
"They know. Best get moving."
They camped that night under an overhanging rock. Not having planned on the girl, they found their supplies were quickly giving out. The Shang horse had had no food bag. It seemed to Asgalt that he had just fallen asleep when Aithne was shaking him. "Your Grace, time to be moving. The Shang followed into the night." Asgalt rose quickly, and his body protested. Pain shot through his back, and his elbows and shoulders felt as if they were locked in irons.
"What? How do you know?"
Flan spoke quietly. "I awoke early, slipped down the trail, saw them. They gained quite a bit on us." The Duke nodded.
"Let the horse go. From here on up we have to climb. One more day, Then we can be over the bridge by mid-morning of the next."
Flann discarded his armor and shield, keeping only his sword and spear. He suggested that Asgalt do the same, but the Duke shook his head.
"No. I've had both for 20 years, and when they build my cairn I want them inside. And I need the axe."
The climb was slow and painful. Asgalt watched with envy as Flann made his way up, his breathing never quickening nor his stride faltering. Asgalt felt as if he weighed a ton, but stubbornly refused to discard his armor. He cursed the soft living and resolved to spend more time in the field, refusing to admit that age had anything to do with it. The land leveled, and the going became easier. Asgalt pointed.
"There's a stream over there. Good place to rest a moment. Afterwards it's a bad climb, but we'll have a good place to sleep. It eases off in the morning."
Aithne greeted the small stream and pond with a cry of pleasure. Quickly she ran and jumped in it. Flann and Asgalt both smiled, and Flann quickly followed the girl. Asgalt slipped off his armor, and the release from the weight felt good. Then he too slipped into the pool. But knowledge of what was ahead of them and what was behind them made the stay brief. Asgalt brought the spears back, leaned them against the rock, and spread their clothes to dry. They finished the last of the food, drank some water, then slowly dressed. Just as they had finished dressing, Flann looked back up the stream, and his voice was cold and flat.
"Well, we're in it now."
Asgalt followed his gaze. There, beside his armor and the only way out, stood 3 Shang warriors. The Duke grunted and spat disgustedly.
3 fully armed men and us with only spears."
He glanced around, and the bare rock walls loomed mockingly over him. He turned, plucked a knife from his belt, and casually tossed it to Aithne.
"Here, girl, in case we fail."
Asgalt and Flann watched stoically as the 3 Shang closed their ranks and began a slow march toward them. Fully armed, the 2 would have been more than a match for the 3. Fully armed, one alone may have won, but armed with nothing but a spear apiece, and with no armor, their future looked dim indeed. Both were too experienced in combat to feel they had much chance. Suddenly the Shang stopped, and one pointed with his sword.
"Old man, do you know me? Look well and long, for I mean to give your dead eyes a better view on the end of my lance."
Asgalt snarled and roared.
"You spawn of a snake! I missed you once, but I won't now."
He then spoke quietly to Flann.
"I know that dog. We fought once before, and my horse bolted before I could kill him. Then a Spey woman said he would never die by my hand. Since then he's hoped to meet me."
His voice grew low and urgent.
"Listen. We may stand a chance. He's convinced that I want to kill him myself. What I want you to do is charge with me. Then before we hit, fall back and stab whatever comes open. I'll hit alone. But whatever you do, keep glancing at Artor, the one with the red shield."
The 2 gripped their spears and started forward. Their right hands gripped the butts, holding them tight and close to the hip, while their left hands were extended along the shaft. Their pace quickened, and both pairs of eyes glanced left. Artur the Shang muttered low to his men, and their gait increased. Suddenly Asgalt broke into a run, and Flann quickly caught up with him, but just as contact was to be made, Flann dropped back. Asgalt's spear pointed directly at the man in the center, but eyes constantly glancing left, leaped forward, spun, and drove his spear directly into the face of the man on his right. The spear had skimmed the top of the shield, smashed upward through the roof of the mouth, and stuck in the bone of the skull. Wrenching his spear loose, he barely slid aside in time to avoid the shearing stroke of a sword. Off balance from missing his blow, the man stumbled. Asgalt grabbed his shield with one hand, spun him around, and drove his spear into his back. The Duke looked up in time to see Artur's sword about to descend, when Flann, in a clean, hard lunge, drove his spear through the body of the Shang. The spear caught Artur under the arm, and actually pierced the shield on the other side of his body. Artur staggered. Shock and pain clouded his face. He looked at Flann, then back to Asgalt.
"You! didn't kill me," he muttered. Then his eyes glazed. He fell heavily, twitched, and lay still. The rest of the climb was brutal. It seemed to Asgalt that he must have completely forgotten just how much physical exertion it required. He was thankful that the girl was sturdy, so that only a few times were they required to actually lift her. When they reached the ledge where they would make their camp, only pride kept him from collapsing at once. The Shang had all carried food bags, so at least there was now plenty to eat. The fare was plain, but all thought they had never tasted better. "Asgalt, what do we face tomorrow?" "A short climb, then it's merely a hard walk. Once we reach the top, it'll be over." Flann looked quizzical. "How did you build a bridge?" "We didn't build a bridge the first time we crossed. There used to be a tree, and we got a rope caught in it, and I swung across. We built it from the other side. It was while we were trying to raise an army. It was a good place to escape to if there was need. He was determined to keep the royal blood alive, and we could hole up, then dash across. We built the bridge from the other side, and old Lyof, cagey he was, designed it so that it would be easy to chop through from this side. Other side has rock foundations." Conversation died, and the stars shone down, diamond bright in the crisp, clear night air. Asgalt leaned his blade against the rock and tried to sleep, but for a change sleep eluded him. He watched Aithne and Flann, heard the low, muted laughter, saw the looks into each other's eyes. He smiled to himself, and he remembered another girl, one with hair black as night, and lips that were red, and eyes that laughed. Another night, long ago, when he had sat with her, and their eyes had met. He could still hear her laugh, see her smile, and feel the touch of her hand. How the people had gasped when he had married her and made her a duchess. The life they had was good. The pain of losing her was still with him. It had been hard, but she had given him 2 strong sons and 2 beautiful daughters, and he must see that they were taken care of. He sat up and shook off the inexplicable nostalgia. "Flann, let me interrupt you, children." He took off his ducal ring. "Take this. It's foolish for me to pretend I'm not bone-tired, and the 2 of you can make better time down the mountain to the way station than I can. Take this, show it to the guard there, and grab 2 fast horses and go on to Castle Jagai. Give the ring to Olwen, and have him send riders out to raise the levy. He'll know what to do." Flann took the ring. "Aye, and I'll have him prepare a hero's welcome for his lord." Asgalt laughed. A hero. Hell, have him prepare for a tired old man. And Lyof will have parades and pageants after this is over. Now let me get some sleep." But the sleep was brief, and this time Asgalt awakened with both Aithne and Flann. Food was gulped hurriedly, and the last leg of the journey was begun. The last of the climb was hard but quick. As they reached the top, as if planned, all 3 turned in unison and looked back down the trail. Sun glinted off Shang armor. Shaking his head in disgust, the Duke muttered, "We're a lot alike, the Shang and I. We never let up, and we never forget." The last portion was made at a dog trot over flat, firm earth. A quick turn, a small hill, and the bridge was before them. It spanned a chasm that was only the width of 5 tall men, but it extended out of sight on either side, and the eye was lost in the distance to the bottom. The bridge was a simple, crude affair, no railings, but 2 ropes on either side gave some security. "Flann, go cut the ropes on that end while I undo these." He knelt and began working on the thick rope. By the time he had finished, Flann had cut both and was standing beside him. Asgalt stripped off his armor and began to fashion a sling to go around his body and between his legs. Once this was done, he turned to Flann and Aithne. "You 2 go on ahead. I can cut the bridge loose from this side and cross on the 2 remaining ropes. This was in case we ever got caught on this side. I told you old Lyolf was cagey.
Flan shook his head. Let me climb down. I can cut them quicker than you.
No, I helped build it. I'll cut it down. Now get on across.
Asgalt secured the rope and lowered himself until he was even with the supporting posts of the bridge. He swung out and back until he had grasped a beam, then wedged himself between it and the cliff, wrapping his legs tight around the wood. He leaned back. He was tired and wanted to rest for a few minutes, but there wasn't time. He removed the axe from his belt and began to chop. The space was narrow, and the cut had to be made close to his body so that there was little room for a full swing. He swung the axe in short, hard blows, wrenching it to clear the blade on each stroke. His hand cramped and his forearm began to quiver with the strain, but he never ceased his relentless rhythm. It seemed to him that with each stroke the wood grew harder and the axe grew duller. But slowly, ever so slowly, the cut widened and deepened. He stopped, thrust the axe back through his belt, and massaged his aching hand and forearm.
A few more should do it, he thought. Damn will I be glad to rest in a bed again beside a nice warm fire.
He hooked his knees about the beam, and trusting to the thick rope, leaned out, swinging the axe upward in vicious strokes as if the wood were a personal enemy. The wood cracked and broke loose, and Asgalt kicked out and swung free in case the whole bridge broke loose, but it sagged, creaked, and held. The Duke ignored the yawning chasm below him, and cursed with a fervor and feeling that was awesome in its intensity. Still cursing, he pulled himself back up the rope, attached it on the other side, and began the whole process over. Sweat stung his eyes, and his back began to ache from the strained, unnatural position. He worked more slowly, and would stop after several strokes to gauge the depth of the cut and to clear his vision. The bridge creaked and sagged even further as the amount of wood holding it grew less. After what seemed hours, the top began to splinter and snap. He quickly slipped off the beam, and as he kicked back and away, swung the axe once more. The axe bit, the wood cracked, and the bridge slipped downward, grabbing the axe, flipping it loose from his grip. Then bridge and axe fell end over end into the depths below. Asgalt watched the dwindling shapes.
Man could starve before he hit bottom,
he thought. Again he pulled himself up the rope, this time more slowly. A shout greeted him, and he saw Flan and Aithne wave from the other side. "Well done, Lord Duke, well done!" Asgalt waved tiredly. Even his bones ached. His forearms quivered uncontrollably, and his knees were flaccid, almost unable to bear his weight. He sat down heavily, his body worn and his eyes dulled with fatigue. His hand aimlessly gripped the hilt of his sword. He gazed blindly at the mail shirt, helmet, and shield that lay at his feet. Wearily he rose and walked back along the path. Far down he could see the first of the Shang as they made the turn, walking cautiously, expecting an ambush behind every rock.
"Still time,"
he muttered under his breath. He walked back and picked up his mail, slipped it on, and buckled the sword about his waist. The familiar weight felt comforting, an old friend. Once again he sat down on the rock, ignoring the urgent shouts from Flan and Aithne. He chuckled to himself.
"They're right. I'm growing old. Old Lyolf was right. It comes before you know, and soon you don't even care."
He looked across the gorge to Flan and Aithne, and their youthful figures brought back a flood of memories, and his past life fled across his mind's eye. He remembered the aimless wanderings, the battles. He stood again on the walls of Castle Glown, with Colwyn beside him, holding the breach against attack after attack until the enemy fell back, dismayed and broken, and not being able to break 2 men. He wandered again, guarding the life of the king and the young prince, and he remembered the final charge in the battle for the crown, the foes falling before him until he had reached the standard, cutting down the bearer, and then with one stroke cutting through the helmet, head, and chest of Morgane. He realized suddenly that life had been good to him, that he had achieved a great deal, and that now the battles were over. All he had to do was walk across that rope bridge. There would be parades and feasts and even tournaments all in his honor. And once that was over, there would be a quiet life for the remainder of his years. He would grow old and slightly fat, and honors would still be heaped on him. His sons were near grown, and his daughters already promised. The kingdom was secure, no new threats, no new battles. He thought of how nice it would be to sleep in a soft bed, to take an attractive serving girl to the same bed. Yes, life would be pleasant until that final sleep in that same soft bed. The Duke of Jagai stood and warily reached for his helmet and shield, an old man, gray hair glinting in the sun, and tired beyond belief. The sword flashed in a short, bright arc, and the rope parted and twisted its way downward. The years of fatigue seemed to melt from his body as he buckled his helmet and dressed his shield on his arm. He stood straight and tall and strong, and his eyes were hell-bright. With a strong and steady stride, Asgalt, Duke of Jagai, marched down to meet the Shang. This has been The Age of the Warrior by Hank Reinhardt, read by Jeff Aguiar.
Thank you, Jeff.
That was a special audio presentation from the hallowed and haunted coffers of the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And an extra large bottle of Ghost Off Repellent and an abacus that works backward and in ancient Sumerian. Plus thanks, praise, and plaudits for Tim Powers, author of Forced Perspectives. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.